people manipulated the market so that they can have a lot of gain, whether that is politician insider trades because they know about COVID ahead of time, or some famous hedge fund managers saying they're not going to invest in China, but 1 month later they say China stocks are suddenly cheap enough, so then they go all in. So I think it's these kind of thought process you need to go through, having that objective mind, which will help you succeed as an investor. And air conditioning or heating around the world is just a very clear example of something that is popular, something that is viral, but then end up you're going with the wrong conclusion. So welcome back to my channel. And in this video, we're going to talk about a counterintuitive topic, misinformation, or arriving at the wrong conclusion. So I was browsing through YouTube the other day and I came across this video by Kento Bento. So I believe this person is from Hong Kong as well. And he made a viral video on how Hong Kong became a giant refrigerator. Now, obviously, this is a climate change video. And I guess the premise here is to convince you to use less air conditioning. And 1 minute into the video, the surprising fact here is 34% of electricity used in Hong Kong is for air conditioning. Now, if you are familiar with places near the equator, obviously it's very hot, so it makes sense that, hey, a lot of electricity is used to cool the city. So then the question, what should we do about it? And obviously, if as you watch the video and you learn more about it, you will realize that, hey, to stop climate change, we should stop using AC. And perhaps that's the conclusion we should arrive to. And this actually happens quite often when you're on the internet, is to correctly come to your own conclusion. So obviously, when you're looking at a video like this, you already know what the direction it's heading towards. But the question, is it true? Is it just Hong Kong? Is it, in a sense, correct solution to solve climate change is to stop using AC? So I did a little bit more research and I come to my own conclusion. Now, I'm not saying my conclusion is correct, but I'm saying when you are absorbing information on the internet, especially when it comes to investing, you need to have a very objective mind. So you don't want to be taking someone's YouTube video like mine at face value without doing research. So that's why we focus so much on coming to your own conclusion and doing research when it comes to investing, because that's actually what's important. So first, let's think about Hong Kong. It's a very hot city, and it's so hot that people actually die. So here is an article from SCMP, South China Morning Post. In 2021, just this year, a Hong Kong hiker dies as soaring temperature makes Sunday hottest day in May record. So just some guy hiking in Hong Kong can die because of the heat. So I think we should take a minute to think about that. If the conclusion of that video is to tell us not to use AC as much, but then people die as a result, then air conditioning is really a necessity, not a luxury. So by not using AC and telling people not to use AC, it means somebody are going to die. Now, if we take a look at one of the academic study here that I pulled up by Emily, William, Jacqueline in Hong Kong, then they did a study on the mortality rate related to temperature. Okay? And what they're saying here is that an average 1 degree increase daily for temperature above 28.2 degrees Celsius is associated with a 1.8% increase in mortality. So basically what this is saying is that the hotter it is, more people will die. And it's especially true for low social economic districts. Okay? So this is actually quite common. It hits the news almost every single year, is that some older generation, they don't have air conditioning. They might just have a fan, or they ran out of electricity in some of the poorer neighborhoods. People die because of heat. So when we are advocating for not using air conditioning, we need to think carefully what is the consequence of doing that? Like, why is air conditioning there to start with? Because if it is too hot, our bodies cannot handle it, and literally people die. So then the question is, if that is the case, are you willing to not use aircon? Which is quite an interesting hypothesis, isn't it? Now, when you're digging this a little bit deeper and you look at USA, I assume you're from North America when you're looking at this video, 1,300 deaths per year are due to extreme heat. So this is not an isolated problem in Hong Kong. This concerns Singapore, Japan, USA, and people die because it's too hot. And if they had air conditioning, what we're saying here is we could have prevented those deaths. Now, whether they have enough money for air conditioning, whether they have the place for air conditioning, so on and so forth, that's a separate issue. But if they had air conditioning, I think we can all agree that certain deaths are avoidable. And right now in my mind, what I'm picturing is really a grandma in Hong Kong that is living in one of those wooden metal houses with no air conditioning, poor electricity, and they just have a fan that works sometimes or it doesn't work most of the time. Now, when we're looking at cooling in Hong Kong, we also need to look at the flip side, heating. So when I'm looking at this problem, you need to think what is the opposite, right? Now, when you're looking at heating, and let's say for a colder country like Canada, where I'm from, space heating is 61% for electricity consumption. Okay. So this seems to be a very high number. In fact, this number is so much higher than the amount of electricity used by Hong Kong for cooling. So if we think about the opposite problem, should we tell people not to use space heating? And for those of my friends who are living in Canada, you already know the answer. You cannot live in Canada without heating. There are a few winters where our heater broke and it was a nightmare. I was wearing like two jackets in house. And when I was sleeping, I was like freezing. And that was many years ago. So we know Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto, Chicago, New York, you need heating. There's no way around it. It doesn't make sense to not use heating. So the only question is, how can we make it more efficient? How can we make it more environmental friendly? The question is not, well, should we not use air conditioning? Because people die, so we should. So then the question is how to make it more sustainable. Now, another country for comparison is really Singapore. Now, if you look at the location for Singapore, it is hotter than Hong Kong. And here you can see for commercial buildings, 40 to 50% is actually used for cooling. And this makes sense, right? Like when you look at the data, it makes sense because they're closer to the equator. They are a hotter city. And you know that if you go to Singapore without air conditioning, you're going to have a hard time being there. So when you're thinking about this number that is being presented in the beginning of the video, you need to ask yourself, is this an outlier or is this an average? If you are thinking this in terms of heating compared to other countries like Singapore, turns out it's actually not that high. If you're thinking about this number compared to heating, which for some of the colder countries like UK, Canada, Northern Europe, is actually not that much. Like they spend 60% of their electricity on heating. Maybe we should stop or solve the heating problem first. Okay. Now, when you're looking at the world, heating is actually the largest energy use. And it's actually 50% of the energy consumption here. So if you're wondering, this is an IEA.org website. You can look this up. And an interesting fact here that they tie together contributes to 40% of global carbon dioxide emission. Now, when you're thinking very carefully about this sentence, is it true that heating causes carbon dioxide? Or is there some additional detail to this that is not necessarily true? And that's what you got to think about when you're investing, right? Just because you saw a news article on Bloomberg, it doesn't mean it's true. In fact, Like when you're thinking about the market, like the market goes up, all the analysts will say, hey, it's going up. The market is going down, the analysts will tell you, hey, it's going down. They are not necessarily predictive. They're only telling you what is happening or what has happened. So I guess the question is, you need to think carefully about how heating and cooling works. So let me just give you a quick 30-second on how an air conditioning work. This is a theoretical image of air conditioning. You can find it on Google, very straightforward. And you get two parts. You have a fan and bring in the hot air. It cools using this kind of solvent or water here and bring the hot air to the outside, which is why your air conditioning needs to be facing outward to bring that hot air out. And then you cool down the air and circulate it back into the room. So what does that really mean? It means that an air conditioning has two components, this little water mechanism plus two fans. That's it. So this is fully electric. That's why you don't need to connect anything additional to it because there's only two fans and that water cooling mechanism in the middle. Now, obviously, this is a simplification, but you can see that, hey, there's no carbon dioxide emission. Look carefully. How does this emit carbon dioxide? It doesn't. The carbon dioxide emits from energy generation. It's the way you generate energy, not the usage of air conditioning. So let's go further. Now, I searched this up, and when you're looking at the facts, people make the misconception that using air conditioning creates carbon dioxide, which is true indirectly, but it also depends on how your city creates or generates electricity. So if you're looking at Hong Kong, it's actually coal, nuclear, and natural gas. So all three, other than nuclear, actually generate a lot of CO2. So in a sense, that is correct. But if you're looking at a place like Canada, Vancouver, mostly is hydro, then hey, using air conditioning or heating in Vancouver will not generate as much carbon dioxide. So what is the solution here? The solution is not telling people not to use air conditioning because if you don't, every 1 degree, more people die. The solution here is the sustainability of electricity generation. Okay? Now, before I jump to this final chart, I just want to talk about Bitcoin also uses a lot of energy. So here is 91 terawatt hours of energy used by Bitcoin. And if you have a coal plant and you burn coal to mine Bitcoin, then technically Bitcoin is very not sustainable. So if you use solar energy to mine Bitcoin, then suddenly you can be like, hey, mining Bitcoin is very sustainable. So you got to think carefully on how the energy is generated. Now let's go to the last chart here. So the last chart here is really a study done by UK Parliament on the range of carbon footprint for UK and European technologies. So it's not that complicated. It's almost the same around the world. And here you can see biomass. That's fossil fuel. Here, this is solar. Now, this is not exactly the newest article I can find. Let me just take a look at the date here. This is back in 2006. So probably solar is going to be even lower now. And then you have marine, like wave technology, hydro, which is the dam, wind, and nuclear. So you can see the carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. Turns out hydro, wind, nuclear are the lowest. And if you use this to power your aircon, then technically it's very environmentally friendly. It's very sustainable. And you can cool the world off using hydropower. You can cool the world off using wind power, nuclear power. You can use this to heat up your home. And when this video said, hey, stop using aircon, you need to think carefully whether that is true. And that's what investing is all about, is making that judgment to determine whether something is true or not, because there's a lot of noise in the market. There's a lot of hidden agenda, different intention. And we're not even talking about fraud here. We're just talking about people trying to manipulate the market. I have a lot of stories where people